I'm in a completely anomalous position of introducing Donald Pease at an institution that is almost identical with him. I always think that, I shouldn't say it that way, I should say it this way. I can never think of Dartmouth without thinking of Don, and with Don without Dartmouth. And Dartmouth knows that it owes Don a great deal, and Don knows that he has benefited enormously from being at Dartmouth. So to those of you who are Dartmouth people, there's nothing I can tell you. And those of us who are Boundary 2 Collective people, there's nothing I can tell you either, but nonetheless I have to say something. So I will tell myself something. Don's first post-PhD encounter with the Boundary 2 Collective, I'm sure you remember this, was in New York City at Union Theological Seminary. Followed shortly after a University of Chicago critical inquiry conference on narrative, right? Where I believe Jonathan and Don had met for the first time. So English Institute. And Jonathan comes to join the collective in meeting at Union Theological Seminary at one of these sessions, which was being sponsored by Cornell West. And into the session, Don appeared, dressed differently than he is today. And Cornell was giving a talk. Don was asking a question. Cornell was listening. Don was posing, listening. I found myself literally between them in the space of the room, translating discourses, which was quite a remarkable experience. And from that time, which was either 1977 or 78, Don has been invaluable, I can't stress this word enough, it's an invaluable figure both for the collective and for me. He is a person who not only reads texts with enormous precision, generosity, breadth, but he has as well the kind of rare visionary capacity that only truly magnificently outstanding critics bring to bear on their work. We can go through all of his mechanical achievements. Right? We could read his CV. We would tell stories of his Guggenheims, his NEHs. We talk about the American Studies Institute here, the participation in the School of Cynicism and Dreary, which Hortense and I were fortunate enough to be given fellowships to in its first meeting, and which I failed to attend. I did not attend on the advice of Edward Said, who said, "Why would you go there?" And so on. Don's books, of course, are well-known, highly respected, from his studies of Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, whose chair he holds with great success and honor, to the many books that we all know he has in his drawer, but we're waiting to see. His books on American drama, for example, which we're waiting to see. He is, of course, also the leading literary American critic on the problems of the Cold War, the person who has best adapted a model of thinking about that kind of profound social shift that reflected the deepest developments in literary theory in Europe, inflected by psychoanalysis, by Deleuzean thinking about desire, and so on, to produce, in Don's terms, a very deep analysis of the fantasies of the Cold War. In recent years, he's been turning his attention more broadly past the new Americanism to a very deep interest in what's been going on with the new settler colonialism, about which I think he will talk today, and which is inseparably attached, as you'll see in a new essay forthcoming in Boundary 2, from the Trump phenomenon. Okay, so please welcome to Dartmouth, Don Pease. Oh, I didn't give your title.
I'll give the title, don't
You're going to give the title. Okay.
They've had enough of this. So I too have profound debts to Boundary 2. Jonathan, as Paul mentioned, brought me to Boundary 2 for the first time. And it changed, it literally was a change in my career. And I'm deeply indebted to everyone in this room. I won't go into details, I'll do so at the banquet. But this is now to hear a talk. So this talk, as Paul has pointed out, is part of work that I'm presently involved in. I want to, as I've mentioned to Jonathan, suggest that the so-called American Renaissance was actually, it emerged from settler militarism, the United States taking that posture in the early years of the Cold War. So I'm completely rethinking my previous work on the American Renaissance. And this essay is an attempt to grapple with what enabled Donald Trump to emerge as a recognizably American phenomenon. Those people think he's aligned with European fascism, but he's reanimated settler colonial logics that are important, I think, to recognize. So I'm just going to go into it. This is going to be a brief description of the relationship between liberalism and settler colonialism, in which I argue that settler colonialism cannot be dissociated from liberalism, although it's always disavowed. And I'm going to give a case study of birtherism as a salient example of the reawakening of the settler colonist mentality. The top-down story of American democracy is often recounted as the progress of political ideals, of individual liberty, rule of law, consent, emanating from Enlightenment centers in Europe to American founders and then to the rest of the globe. Yet the nation emerged from revolt and warfare, and the paradigmatic historical agents responsible for the nation's emergence were Anglo-American settler colonists. Anglo-American settler colonialism complicates colonialism understood as a relationship to a distant ruling authority, in that Anglo-American settlers did not simply extract wealth and then return with their booty to the metropole. Settler colonialism is premised on displacing indigenes and replacing them on the land they expropriated. According to Chief Justice John Marshall, when American settlers won independence from England, they acquired through this victory exclusive right to extinguish Indian entitlement to occupancy and retroactively disallowed them, the Indians, the condition of ownership that the court defined as an exclusively Euro-American faculty that did not pre-exist the right of discovery. Echoing John Locke, Justice Marshall described Indians' uncultivated relationship to land as proof there was no inherent right to property, and that only the appropriation of land through labor provided rights of ownership. Since Marshall, the constitutional justifications for American society has been that rights are given substance by property and made private in acts of appropriation settled through entitled ownership, which in turn is the basis for the self-determination of possessive individuals, liberal individualism. Popular histories and fictions disaggregate American beginnings. Popular histories and fictions of the nation's beginnings routinely disaggregate American settler colonist struggle to overthrow British tyranny from the practices of enslavement and Indian killing. These popular accounts invariably refuse to acknowledge liberalism and settler colonialism as mutually constitutive logics. However, in his 2010 monograph, The Two Faces of American Freedom, the historian of law Aziz Rana attempted to redress this lapse by excavating the military, economic, and legal apparatuses interconnecting American settlers' notions of individual personhood, self-rule, free trade, private property, and other core values of American liberal democracy with the practices of indigenous dispossession, enslavement, economic exploitation, environmental devastation, what Rana calls the second face of American freedom, responsible for their development. Rather than as an unevolved historical trace, settler colonialism might be better understood as a precondition of and the social formation historically responsible for the emergence of both Trump's unemancipatory democratic movement and the formation as well of the liberal principles and institutions to which Trumpists are inalterably opposed. This complex and contradictory history is known, but remains unthought in contemporary liberal political discourse. When Trump assumed the persona of an archetypal settler-conqueror, he perforce displayed the formerly disavowed second face of freedom that gladly countenanced the interdependence of American civilization and the acts of barbarism that achieved it. The settlement of America involved the violent expropriation of land, a campaign of genocidal violence directed against the land's inhabitants, the exploitation of the labor power of slaves forcibly uprooted from Africa, and a successful revolution against a European imperial power. Trump associated his movement's power with the settlers' rights of revolutionary conquest and instructed MAGA-ers to refuse to feel either personal guilt or collective shame for their forebears having routed foes whose unwillingness to accept defeat was inherited by their 21st century descendants. Trump never regarded as admirable the resistance of the indigenous peoples or rebellious slaves or the British loyalists the settlers defeated. However, he wholeheartedly identified with the settler conquest disposition of Andrew Jackson, the U.S. president who overthrew a British imperial army in the 1812 war, who carried out Indian removal policies, and who put down slave rebellions. At press conferences and during stump speeches, Trump took pleasure in exemplifying the ethos and bearing of President Andrew Jackson. He urged members of the Make America Great Again movement to revivify Jackson's nation-making violence in battles with radical Muslim terrorists, feminists, members of the Black Lives Matter movement, Antifa, and protect the Republic against other 21st century versions of these enemies who did not know how to stay conquered. Trump also redirected settler colonial violence inward against an ensemble of political antagonists whose campaigns for social justice, equal political and civil rights, reparations for historical wrongs would deprive the real Americans in his movement of their birthright privileges of supervisory control of the nation. Now, this is the case study. It's called Birtherism, a lie too big to be untrue. Donald Trump's presidential campaign officially began on March 23, 2011, when he asked the co-host and audience of The View, popular daytime television talk show, why doesn't he show his birth certificate? There's something on that birth certificate that he doesn't like. In posing variations of this question on numerous occasions and in different settings, Trump presented himself as a conduit for the circulation of a pre-existing interactive fiction concocted by members of the Tea Party movement concerning the authenticity of Barack Obama's birth certificate. At the time Trump asked this question, he had not formally announced his candidacy for the presidency. He had not taken part in either the production or the consumption of birther narratives. He had not offered an alternative vision of America, and he had not yet come up with the idea of integrating segments of the Tea Party and other political, religious, economic, and social factions into the Make America Great Again movement. However, the moment Trump transferred this, in quotes, big lie from the precincts of a disreputable and designated as extremist alt-right communication networks to the center of the presidential race, he seized control, he's a great primitive accumulator, of a vast voting bloc consisting primarily of white nationalists in the Tea Party and other extreme factions on the far right who regarded Obama as more African in his roots than he is American. Before Trump's takeover, the Tea Party was a leaderless, reactionary fringe group lacking strong ties to the Republican Party, whose members were best known for the tricorn hats, Gadsden flags, and other colonial-era regalia they kitted out when staging protests of Obama's, in quotes, colonial despotism. Speaking and acting from the subject position of aggrieved white entitlement, already opened by the Tea Party's fierce antagonism to Obama's party policies, Trump transformed the Tea Partiers' heterogeneous, inconsistent, counterinsurgent, politically reactionary motives and purposes into the agentic, resurgent, white settler nationalism of the Make America Great Again movement. When Trump asked the question, he summoned into virtual existence the political movement to which he conferred ontological reality in the hundreds of rallies he's held since he officially announced his candidacy for the office of president on June 15, 2015. Trump won the loyalty of this voting bloc because he did what no reputable Republican candidate other than himself would have ever risked doing. By questioning the validity of Obama's birth certificate, Trump unashamedly conjured in the historical present a constellation of non-synchronous scenes of a white man compelling an African American to show his freedom papers, of a white poll worker demanding an African American voter's proof of citizenship, of white immigration officers stopping an African for interrogation at the nation's borders, from the intractably non-progressive facets of United States history that the Trump question synchronized. Trump's question confronted the first black president of the United States with the demand that he show incontrovertible evidence of his certification as a natural-born American citizen. However, at the same time that Trump called for empirical proof of his birth certificate's validity, he assumed a bellicose attitude eager to decertify any document purporting to legitimate Obama's presidency. Obama did, in fact, release the long-term form version of his birth certificate, April 27, 2011. It verified he was born August 4, 1961, in Kapolani Maternity and Gynecological Hospital, Honolulu, Hawaii. That certificate of live birth should have sufficed in a court of law. But Trump's question had not brought the president before a judge. It hauled him into a people's court composed of white settler colonists from the nation's past and present. Not a month after President Obama displayed his long-form birth certificate, on CNN, Trump told Wolf Blitzer, "A lot of people do not think it was an authentic certificate." Trump's citation of what a lot of people find dubious about Obama's birth certificate explains why he never found believable, incontrovertible proof of the authenticity of Obama's certificate. Trump had staged his inquest into the circumstances of President Obama as the basis for a 21st century colonial encounter. Trump understood that the ingrained beliefs upon which birtherism is based cannot be falsified because they're entangled in the deep-rooted conviction held by 19th century settler colonists and a broad swath of his contemporary supporters that no African American can possess the identity credentials required to become a citizen, let alone legitimate candidate for office of president. Trump's questioning channeled the vindictive indignation that white working and middle-class, mostly men, cathected onto birtherist speculation so as to facilitate the recovery of their entitlements. During his presidential campaign, Obama had correlated the moment Martin Luther King called the fierce urgency of now with his campaign's rallying cry, "Yes, we can." Participants in Obama's grassroots movement encouraged voters to believe their ballots could redeem the nation's original sin of slavery. They cast the 2008 presidential election as a redemptive turning point that would empower 21st century Americans to actualize a dream that had previously been deferred to an unattainable future. Trump's questioning opened a space of dubiety in between the matter of historical fact that Obama was elected president of the United States and the legitimacy of the birth certificate documenting his right to be that person. The serial uncertainties Trump associated with the authenticity of Obama's birth certificate instigated doubts that empirical certification procedures could not fully and finally invalidate. There is no certification that can decisively put an end to the legion of birther doubts saturating the gap between Obama's certifiable presidency and its certification. Without a certifiably legitimate response to birther's skepticism, it's impossible, Trump's questioning all but reinstated the qualifier deferred to the dream that Obama's election once seemed to have made an actuality. When he situated America's telos in its white settler slave power past, Trump cast Americans' election of the first black president as a historical fluke, an anomaly, rather than an irreversible step forward into what was then called the nation's post-racial future. Trump's repeated enactment of this settler colonist transaction did not simply contravene Obama's redemptive vision of America, it dispossessed it of its historical efficacy by inciting a temporal rollback to an America wherein a heteropatriarchal white Anglo-Saxon Protestant settler colonist disposition claimed preemptive rule over the nation's past and future. Political pundits have successfully exposed the tissue of lies, distortions, half-truths that birtherism braids together. However, whether birtherism is factually true matters less than the congeries of historically factual white supremacist scenarios it scattered across the contemporary political landscape. Trump supporters behave according to the emotional logic saturating what Brian Masumi has described as a politics of affect that enmeshes emotions and cognition in an inextricable knot. His followers' attachments to Trump's affectively factual fictions were and are stronger than the objective facts his critics present to expose them. What Trump's opponents and critics refuse to recognize or even acknowledge is the ineluctable fact that Trump's question generated a materially real 21st century event that drew upon the settler colonist repertoire of scenarios, themes, setting, antagonists, villains, encapsulated within the birtherist narrative. This birtherist fiction casts Donald J. Trump as a 21st century leader of American settler colonist movement involved in a colonial struggle with an African-American undocumented immigrant who had usurped the sovereign power of the presidency to conduct a domestic war on terror against American citizens. Trump had, in effect, announced his candidacy for office by subordinating the first African-American president to the sovereign power of a collective movement that Trump's question embodied. By confronting Obama with this question about the legality of his birth certificate, Trump took up a subject position that turned President Obama into the condensed signifier for an assemblage of political, economic, and social actors and activities to which Trump's movement set itself in a relationship of insuperable antagonism. When repeated at Trump rallies, this question facilitated the consolidation of settler power from the very highest level of leadership to the most granular structure of feeling to which this power owes its social, cultural, and political longevity. Interpreted from the perspective of birtherism's true believers, Donald Trump's question presumed to recover sovereign nativist control of the United States of America at the precise moment he forced the nation's first black president to show proof of legal belonging. Settler colonialism is not a bygone historical era, or a mode of historical eventfulness whose significance was eliminated with the overthrow of British rule. It is a transhistorical condition of possibility that remains formative while also changing over time. The series of different yet politically linked scenes of subjugation that Trump's question elevated into representation comprised several historical enactments of American settler colonial division of humanity. Although they took place as distinctly different historical events, these instances are nevertheless imbricated within the ongoing sequential eventfulness of the disposition of settler colonialism that birtherism continues. These enfolded processes constitute American settler colonialism as a structural yet sequential event. Trump reperformed this structural event at the moment he took up the position of the American settler. Now, insofar as the settler is a figure who, by the Second Amendment, is constructed as possessing the constituent power of legitimate use of violence in order to extend the nation's expansionist condition, that settler is not a citizen and is not a subject and is not an alien. That settler is a figure who could be understood in archetypal terms as a figure who reappears at every moment of structural transition in the nation's history. To confront President Obama with the question about the legal certifiability of his birth certificate. In extracting his interrogatory stance from this collectively authored birther narrative, Trump activated scenarios of decertification and denaturalization that otherwise lay dormant within birtherism's virtual archive. Trump's iterative questioning did not merely render Obama's decertification imaginable, they activated a retroactive procedure of denaturalization that added the quality of natal alienation to Obama's body at the instant of his birth. From the moment he articulated this inquest that threatened to dispossess the first black president of his right to citizenship, Trump modeled and authorized the conquest mentality of the archetypal American settler colonist. Trump's usage of birtherism to question the certification of Obama's presidency turned the collective movement responsible for the production of this discursive resource into the latter-day settler colonists that he mutated into a legitimate political constituency. That Trump had not merely quickened these vindictive specters, but had done so with pride-filled impunity, warrants the suspicion that the institutions of American liberal democracy could do nothing, and have yet done nothing, to prevent their recurrence. Trump has made it a policy not to put himself in a position where he can be assigned culpability for a potentially criminal action or enterprise. Trump never professes, I like that, never mind, never professes to speak solely for himself. He reportedly starts each day by collating, curating, distilling, discerning his followers' tweets, blogs, and other messaging into executive tweets that at once decide upon and purportedly give expression to the constituent power of the Make America Great Again movement. In his engagement with these latter-day settler colonists, Trump includes the possibility of insurrection against the normative constituted order as a potentiating motive for their aggregation. Although he aligned this people's movement to his purposes, Trump nevertheless claimed to depend upon their constituent right to revolution as the real warrant for his impunity. In the United States, the people and the revolutionary right of the people are the final authorizing power. And he's got a people whose right to revolution he has mobilized into the vectoral impetus for his campaign. In the rallies that followed his announcement to campaign for the presidency, Trump depicted the United States itself as a settler conquest culture in which winning was a permanent ontological condition. That's why he could never concede defeat. Winning is a permanent ontological condition. Trump believed it axiomatic that America's standing as a conquest culture endowed its nation-making violence with the temporal authority to impede modes of historicization that would replace or overthrow it. He viewed the winning or victory culture of his movement as comparable to the culture of settler colonists in that it was always threatened by terrorists from within and without. But if Trump did not want that long-form birth certificate, what bureaucratic procedures did Trump and his political constituency want to set into operation when they questioned the official certification of President Obama's birth? Amongst other matters, Trump wanted to know what process of authorization in a white nation made it possible for the son of an African immigrant from Kenya to be verified as the president of the most powerful country on earth. More specifically, and he's really speaking as the entire bureaucratic, the sedimented relay of settler colonial power in the United States system when he asked the question. More specifically, Trump's question wanted answers as to how and why all the safeguards installed in the bureaucratic infrastructures that organize the American political system in ways that would have and should have made it impossible certification of the son of a Kenya-born African as president failed to accomplish that aim. Over and above all else, Trump's questioning conveyed the demand to know why state-authorized bureaucratic processes responsible for specifying the details surrounding Obama's birth had not yet already done the work of decertification. Such decertification procedures could rely on the nation's sedimented history of settler lawfare, settler colonist warfare, U.S. imperial colonialism, and ongoing settler colonial capitalist predation that installed the American system of governmentality. Could cite the Civil War legal fictions of natal alienation and radical kinlessness that provided ample legal precedent for prohibiting African Americans forever belonging to the nation as free citizens. If necessary, it could requisition the property laws that were fashioned by the judiciary branch of post-Civil War expansionist state to grant western-moving white settlers preemptive ownership of any indigenous land they homesteaded, and the right to construe whiteness itself as a status property, tangentially related to inegalitarian property rights. When situated within the context of his insurrectionist movement, Trump's casting doubt on the validity of Barack Obama's birth certificate can be viewed as having served a set of interconnected psychosocial purposes. This fiction did indeed gratify the antagonistic disposition of a movement whose members took obscene enjoyment in Trump asking a question that harbored the potential penalties not only of the loss of U.S. citizenship and detention and deportation, but the possible capital punishment of America's first black president. However, given its calculable efficacy within the U.S. socio-symbolic order, birtherism might be better understood as a long-term political stratagem designed to take advantage of pre-existing decertification procedures within the bureaucratic infrastructure of the American political system. The birthers in Trump's movement did not restrict their efforts at decertification of birthright citizenship to Obama. They understood Trump's effort at disqualifying the citizenship rights of the first African-American president to entail the disenfranchisement of every African-American voter. In the aftermath of his 2020 election defeat, Trump extended birtherism's juridical provenance to encompass all African Americans who, by virtue of their African heritage, lack the identity credentials required to make them legitimate voters in an American election. If viewed from a birther's perspective, the votes of African Americans, and always already undocumented, hence illegal immigrants, could not be counted as equal to those of Trump's electorate without, in quotes, diluting or polluting the ballots of white voters. It is because he received an even greater number of votes than he had in 2016 that Trump says he won the 2020 election by a landslide. Trump based this claim on birtherism's aspiration to invalidate the votes of millions of Americans on the basis of race and heritage. Because blacks and migrants cannot belong to the America over whom the real American people have the birthright to sole ownership, they cannot vote in the country to which they do not belong. These voters cannot cast genuinely legal ballots, according to the ideology of birtherism, in the America over whom the real Americans in Trump's movement rule because they lack the property, namely whiteness, needed to belong. However, Trump's contestation of election results was not simply based on birtherism's aspirational ideals. It had a material basis. It was built on the infrastructure of an entrenched culture of minority rule buttressed by an insurrectionary populist movement whose members considered the 2020 election results a theft of their country. book based his claim that the election was stolen on the fact that the Republican state legislatures in the swing states he won in 2016 had already purged voter rolls, passed use it or lose it rights to vote laws, authorized retroactive signature checks, reduced or eliminated ballot boxes and drive-in registration sites, and other voter suppression legislation that supposedly should have made it impossible for Trump to lose the 2020 election. I want to try to explain a term that Brian Masumi uses, an affective fact, because it's a performative. It's a performative that's very interesting. Trump's assertion that if something isn't done, the Democrats will steal the 2020 election affected what Brian Masumi, in his wonderful book Onto Power, calls an affective fact. For Trump supporters, the threatened reality of the state of affairs referenced in this alarum seemed so superlatively real that it translated into a certainty about the election, even in the absence of any actual grounding for it in observable facts. The measure of its factuality pertained to the immediacy of the response to the threat the alert triggered, more than any correspondence with the semantic content of the observable facts. The threat of the loss of the election generated a performed commensurability of the alert to the action it triggered, namely the January 16th insurrection that qualified the alarum's accuracy. The threat, "I am warning you, if we don't do something to stop the steal we will lose our country," overlays its own conditional determination upon the objective situation through the mechanism of alarm that makes the threatening and the objective coexist. If the threat does not materialize, it still always would have, if it could have. This would have been voter fraud if it could have been voter fraud. Rather than referential truth value, Trump's alert possessed performative threat value. Trump's supporters involved in the reproduction of this affective fact trafficked in lurid spectacles of trucks dumping votes in the millions cast by dead in the civil and literal sense, black people and other, in quotes, aliens. According to these collectively authored fantasy productions, such illegal vote counting invariably took place under the shield of darkness and occurred only within the rat-infested, unsupervised polling stations in cities with sizable African-American populations, specifically Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia, within the swing states that Trump lost. To right this wrong, Trump's legal team asked various courts to invalidate millions of black and undocumented immigrant votes and extend his term in office. When the courts did not arrive at this verdict, Trump enjoined his movement to complete the coup d'etat prefigured. His election in 2016 was a coup d'etat, prefigured in his 2016 election. In its prolongation of the gap between the votes cast on election night and the inauguration of Joseph Biden as 46th President of the United States, the period of transition in which there was not an authorized transfer of power, the period of transition behaved like an incubator, busily hatching unacted upon eventualities that had lain dormant in Trump's 2016 election. Stop the coup might have been, and in some quarters was, taken as a realistic call to action during the early morning hours of November 9, 2016. Without a planetary reckoning with the settler imperial specters of American liberal democracy, time in this après-coup will belong to its revenants. That's it. So questions? Yes. Oh, Jonathan, and then.
Christian was up first.
Okay.
The hugely invigorating, Don. I'm wondering if I can get you to reflect on your own debt to, let's say, anti-Jacksonian traditions in American thinking, right? You've called out one very strong American tradition, but it seems to me you're summoning another. New England intellectuals have been polemicizing against Jackson since the 1820s. That was the best speech that John Quincy Adams never got to give. And it seems like you're hitting a lot of the marks of a progressive Whiggism, or that's going to turn into a progressive Republicanism.
I'm not aligning myself with any of the forces that you've specified.
Yeah.
The sole way in which liberalism and the disavowed settler colonialism that is inextricably connected to it can be genuinely disrupted will entail a collective movement on the left, not yet animated or activated, led by the figures who continue to be the victims of settler colonial liberalism. And those forces, and I think some folks who speak after me will begin to specify more specifically, are in emergence.
But do you think that the critique of Jacksonianism falls outside, it fell outside because it's a very old stance, fell outside of settler colonial formation?
No, I do not, because the critique was itself enunciated by persons who continued to disavow, in the name of what you called Whiggish progression, the telos of progressivity. They were still aligned with what they disavowed. If you do not recognize and acknowledge, this planet seems at present to have, I mean, in Americanist terms, two non-synchronous iterations of American settler imperialism. Many have identified Ukrainians nepotistically and native, by way of a nativist standpoint, with America at the time of the revolution. And what Putin is doing is what America has been doing since 1945. It's the settler imperialism that organized the liberal international order. So when I spoke of an event, a global event, that can truly bring about a reckoning, I was speaking to that. Yes. Oh, Jonathan was first, Ronald, and then? All right.
I think that you've been doing a sadly necessary great job of sharpening your tools on this over some years, and it's remarkable to hear. I suppose, let me ask just a few formula type questions. So, is Lincoln any resource against Jackson or not? It sounds like
No.
not. Okay.
No, he wanted the entire colonization movement that he recommended is a poster child for precisely the disavowed settler colonial logic.
Okay, and why does the right to revolution override the right to union at this point?
The right to revolution, at the point of the Civil War, you're saying?
No,
The right to revolution in the United States, the way, if you, the in quotes, founders put in that Second Amendment, which gives the right of a militia to bear arms, because they wanted to put into the Constitution the right to revolution of American settlers who felt, settler citizens, who felt oppressed by the existing structure of government. And the right to revolution is, although Negri and others romanticize it, it's really connected to the extension to individual citizens of the legitimate monopoly over violence. constituent power cannot be separated from the capacity to determine who will live and who will die. And there is, because Americans can never establish the autochthony that they long to achieve, because there's always the presence of the indigenous peoples who will disrupt that achievement. That ongoing process is what also demanded that the makers of the Constitution endow American settler citizens with the sovereign right to violence in an ongoing frontier. If you look at what Trump did by calling attention to the border, he showed border control officers who are the best example, contemporary example of the reincarnation of settler colonists on the frontier. Those border patrol officers are in Trump wanted them to be put on full display for what they were doing. What they were doing to families. They were repeating what Justice Taney described as the condition of radical kinlessness and the refusal to recognize any rights that formerly attributed to African Americans. But Trump made this hyper visible because he wanted to wean the American spectator public away from the belief that the liberal principles and ideals, the courts, would have the power to stop this. Not only did the national courts lack the power to stop it, all of the international courts that became involved lacked the power to stop it. So Trump was showing, and this is his condition of impunity, which continues, and I think this is the real reason Garland is not bringing him up for charge, because the Second Amendment is what Trump will cite in order to justify what he's done. It's a way of making the American public feel absolutely powerless in the face of what he did. And continues to happen, by the way, under Biden. So all of this is to say, a lot of us think, Trump is perhaps even so intellectually illiterate that you shouldn't even pay any attention to what he's doing. Well, I think that's the final gambit. If you don't pay attention, it's real reflection, to what he's doing, it's a deliberative, reflexive judgment, then you cannot possibly intervene and disrupt it. Yes, John.
Just so, not John Quincy Adams, not Abraham Lincoln.
Look, don't. I admire all of the persons for lots of very good reasons. This is not an exercise in saying, let's completely disallow. I don't want a trap question, Jonathan.
But, so how is it? I mean, your analysis shows why everyone is Trumpist. To what extent?
No. Donald Trump's Trumpists are conscious revivifications of settler colonialism. Most Americans believe that settler colonialism was an unevolved historical trace that belongs to a past that Americans have transcended. So the logics of disavowal are what control the progressive understanding of American liberal democracy. But my claim is, Jonathan, and this is a radical claim, that until the interdependence, the mutual imbrication of liberalism and the settler colonial logics that laid the foundation for its continuation fails to be addressed, we will continue in this, giving ourselves the delusion that we've really engaged it. I think R.A. and then Stathis.
Done, wonderful. Thank you. 13 clocks, right? Parkinson. It's quite amazing in your analysis, the way that you show how John Quincy's father, John, right, with Sam Adams, started a mess, as they put it, got things stirred up by playing precisely on the trope of the settler and precisely in the trope of the fear, to legitimate the insurrection. It's at the heart of the whole notion and the mechanics of the revolution, as Parker shows us. They pandered to the fear of the Indian, and they pandered to the fear of the slave uprising, and deliberately begin to initiate a rhetoric of whiteness and white settler.
Yes, I agree.
So you're showing that this is bred in the bone.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, picking up on what Christian was asking, we have to indeed, I agree, think differently. But how do we begin to do that in our position? And I'm asking that question, paying close attention to the reaction that you got from the audience and the resistance to understanding the clarity of the analysis, and the resistance, I use that word deliberately and carefully, expressed in the hope that there's something in the archaic past that will give us a way going forward, when in fact, as your analysis points out, and as Parkinson's has pointed out in two good books, no, this is the fabric.
Yeah, it is the fabric. And this is the genius of Trump. It's an instinctual genius. What he's done, think of yourselves as a liberal critic. And you say, and your primary critique of the United States since 1945 is that it has behaved as if a subtler imperial military power rather than a genuine liberal. And notice how Trump is literalizing your critique. He's materialized. He says, I'll be the worst thing you throw at me. I'll be that thing. And that is what diffuses and disarms the critique. But it disarms and diffuses the critique. That it does that, should, it seems to me, put us all in the position of what Kant calls reflexive judgment, in which you do not yet have the criteria to arrive at a determination as to what exactly can be done to intercede and transform. Now you said, what about this moment? Because I'm at a specific point in my career at which I can simultaneously be in and I think and without. I'm going to do this. And I have lots of personal reasons for doing it. Yes, Stathis.
Well, the talk is just stunning clarity. I think clarity is the word. The hermeneutical, even at that level, the hermeneutical precision is extraordinary. So I'm not an American, so I'm not going to think in terms of the past. I want to invite you to, well, you already did. I mean, thinking of this talk along with Leah's, which we heard yesterday, you already did that by your comment.
Oh, I was teaching American drama.
Yeah, you didn't see the talk, but you already did by virtue of the comment. You don't need to know the talk. The question that emerges for me is, how do we manage the vehement critique of liberalism that we engage with on the left? I'm actually speaking of myself, if I may say so. Let's leave it at that. A passionate anti-liberalism that I inhabit, which I understand very, very well, and I'm so happy that you said, in your response to Jonathan and to Christian, they're all in. I mean, of course, it's totally clear to me from the outside. It's totally clear to me, and so let's say my own, vehement anti-liberalism from the left. How do I handle that at the same time while I'm facing the vehement anti-liberalism of exactly the logic you described? Because which includes it's an international thing. It's not just American.
Trump has perfected the anti-liberal stance.
I understand,
and he's done it for a two-tiered reason. Trump in the foreign policy community had, and this is to your question, Jonathan, then about Andrew Jackson, and is also associated with Christian's question. Walter Russell Mead, a Jacksonian foreign policy expert, suggested that the United States has to disrupt the entire liberal international order because it's too costly and it's outdated. Because in the future, the United States has to have not a coalition power, which would be too expensive with NATO and Europe. This is Walter Russell Mead. But it needs to have an inter-imperial conflict with the two powers, the military power of Russia and the economic power of China, and invest all of your resources in it. But no American president prior to Trump would have dared destroy and dismantle the liberal international order that had been in existence and that had given America its vision of moral superiority. So how do you get out of that? You get a human being who has no principles other than conquest, and who believes having a moral code is a trap that rivals put you into in order to get the better of you in trade deals and conflicts. Because Trump was happy to go in and dismantle the entire liberal international order. He found political theorists of the standing of Barry Posen at MIT proposing that Trump's presidency should be understood as the origins of a new grand strategy, a grand strategy of what Posen dubbed, this is a formula, as the illiberal hegemony, the grand strategy of illiberal hegemony.
But Don, just to finish, you actually placed the traditional liberalism in its entire trajectory, including the emancipation.
Yes, I did.
The same settler colonial logic, which is totally right to me. I'm not disputing it.
I certainly did, because you put emancipation in quotation marks. The carceral industrial complex that emerged shortly after emancipation didn't result in freedom. It resulted in another great alibi for the Whiggish history of the United States. And that alibi is grounded on the ongoing disavowal. It's a collectively shared psychic structure that disavow the refusal to know. It's an unthought real in America. The interdependence of settler colonialism and liberalism from the get-go. I can see Paul is getting anxious, as am I. Thank you for your questions.